Hello there! Let's do motherboards and internal connectors. And yep, we're still on a Module 2 video. Like I said in the intro to this series, I'm going to take some of these modules and split them across multiple videos just so that it's a lot easier to get through all of the content without being a super long video. And so far with hardware, I do want to give it a bit of extra attention. People's familiarity with hardware is not as good as it used to be. Partly because laptops and Chromebooks and all-in-one desktops have become way more prevalent than custom-built computers. The thing is, when you want to get into IT, you need to know what's going on inside and be prepared to deal with desktops. So let's look at the main thing that makes a desktop, and that's the motherboard. Now, it is the main board. Everything that you have that makes up a computer is going to get plugged into a motherboard when you are dealing with a desktop. Every single component plugs into it. And thankfully, most modern motherboards have integrated I/O capabilities. Even from this picture you can see over here, built-in input-output ports. You might think, why is that so special nowadays? Today it isn't, but once upon a time it was actually a big deal. And we call that the integrated I/O ports. Now, considering you've got some of the absolute essentials built in there, USB, networking, audio, so forth, all you really need to do to make a working computer is have a CPU, some RAM, a bit of storage, and a power supply unit, and you've got a computer. The only reason why you would want to expand and get expansion cards, clues in the name there, is so that you can either get more of an existing feature, such as more USB ports, or maybe you want to add a new feature, such as wireless networking to a desktop that doesn't have wireless built in. Now, your motherboards come in a variety of form factors, usually geared towards their use case scenario. So with desktop computers, for example, you've got two main families of motherboard form factors. The first one is the ATX, or Advanced Technology Extended family. The first of the family was the original ATX form factor with those dimensions. Nice big rectangular motherboard. Then you get your microATX, often written as MATX, which is a wee bit smaller and about a perfect square as far as size is concerned. And then you also get extended, or EATX, which is a really big motherboard. You'll often find that either in high-performance workstations or some kinds of servers. Then you have your ITX family. Now, the ITX family is more geared towards a smaller form factor of desktop, with mini and nano being two very common you'll find in desktops. Pico and mobile ITX form factors are often for embedded computer systems and will often have soldered on CPUs. Now, for the CompTIA A+ exam, they won't ask you anything beyond the mini ITX form factor, but it is a really small desktop motherboard. Now, you also get some form factors like for laptops, where the motherboard will usually be custom to that laptop model, not just the manufacturer, the model often, and is often called the system board, as most of the components are soldered in and there's not much, if any, opportunity to expand on capabilities. But we'll talk more about that in a video when we get to laptops. And then when you get to the server class, you often are looking at that EATX motherboard form factor we spoke a bit about just now. And you also do get proprietary form factors for servers as well. Now, the annoying part with server motherboards is sometimes they'll use standardized components when they're proprietary, so at least you can get RAM, CPUs, etc. to upgrade or enhance it or just replace faulty components. Other times, though, they will use proprietary components, making repair and maintenance a lot more difficult, and can often be a driving factor in why an organization might choose a particular manufacturer and brand when it comes to their server equipment. Now, with our form factors, it's nice to have a bit of context. So here's what ATX and microATX look like, more or less in proportion, with an EATX board for some perspective. Your mini ITX, as you can see, is way smaller than ATX and even microATX. And then the rest of the ITX family are really tiny. Like I said though, these are just to give you a rough visual idea about how big these form factors are. And it sort of is to scale, but don't ask me what the scale is because I don't know what screen you're watching this on. So Let's have a look at the CPU sockets now on the motherboard. Now here we just need to worry about socket types as far as motherboards are concerned. When it comes to the socket ID correlating with CPU models, that's something that's going to get dealt with in the video where we deal with CPUs. But there will be a code number or name that will correlate to the CPUs that the socket will work with physically. But all CPU sockets are what we call ZIF or zero insertion force sockets. Now the idea is the CPU socket will have some sort of lever arm mechanism that will allow you to open it, insert the CPU, close it, and the socket will apply the force and make contact with the CPU and the motherboard's contact points for obviously connectivity and communication. You do not need to directly apply any force yourself. You just place it in the right spot and let the socket do the hard work for you. Obviously though, you've got to pay attention to keying to make sure you put the CPU in the right way around. If you incorrectly insert that CPU, you could cause some damage. So one of the ways you'll recognize that is usually the CPU will not sit nice and level or flat in the socket. It is something you will experience properly when you do it for the first time if you haven't done so already. So let's get an idea for the main types of sockets though. So the first type you get is the land grid array or LGA socket. The second type is the pin grid array or PGA socket. Now the land grid array has been popular with Intel for many a CPU generation now, and AMD has relatively recently joined the LGA family with its AM5 socket onwards. Now the way the socket works is it's got some angled pins in it so that those pins can make contact with little points on the underside of your CPU. There is a bit of keying for this obviously to make sure you put it in the right way around. There will be a triangle on the one corner of the CPU and there should be a triangle in the socket's corner as well. Those corners must meet each other. The sockets will also have notches and teeth to work with. Usually there'll be some notches in the CPU and there'll be some plastic teeth that you will line your CPU up with. And hopefully if you do it right, it should clip into place no trouble when you close the LGA ZIF socket. Then with your PGA socket, AMD was the last of the CPU manufacturers to still stick with it up till their AM4 model. If you're looking at how old AM4 is now, it is kind of old right now, but you will still come across a lot of computers that use it, especially if you buy secondhand and refurbished. And I'm regularly going to remind you of this. The workplace doesn't throw away computers just because there's a slightly shinier, newer model on the market. Now the way this will work is the socket on the motherboard will have holes in it, and the bottom of the CPU will have pins that will go into those holes. There will also be keying for this as well. Again, there's a triangle in the corner of the CPU and on the socket. Those triangles must see each other. And one corner of the CPU will be missing a pin, and there will also be a corner that doesn't have a hole in the socket. And here's what the LGA and the PGA sockets look like. Now with the LGA sockets, because there is nothing underneath the CPU to grip, what will happen is you will unclip and open this lever arm, and then this metal frame will pivot the opposite way around from the lever arm, and you'll be able to put your CPU in there. Obviously the metal frame is preventing us from seeing the plastic teeth and the corner with the triangle, but when you do open it, you will see it. This is an AM4 socket. It's a PGA socket that AMD was a big fan of. And if you look closely, you can see over here is where the corner is missing its pin, and there's also that little indented triangle. And the way this will work, you just lift the lever arm, place the CPU with that keying the correct way, maybe give it a gentle tap, just to make sure it's properly seated and every pin went in the hole. And then when you're pretty sure about that, you just lower this arm and clip it back into place, and it will hold the CPU nice and securely. Now besides the CPU socket, we also have the motherboard chipset. And believe it or not, this is actually closely related to your CPU. But first, what is a chipset? Well, it's a collection of chips and circuits that usually give the motherboard some intelligence and ability to actually make everything work together. And you'll usually find it under a heatsink on your motherboard. So like I said, it is closely tied to the CPU model. And the CPUs will have chipset models that must be matched. You've got to bear this in mind when building a new PC or upgrading or repairing an existing PC. Now, thankfully, vendors like Intel generally like to use the exact CPU socket to help prevent incompatibility problems by making sure that you can't plug in a CPU that won't work with its chipset. But whenever you are building a PC or upgrading an existing one, look at the CPU you want. That usually will dictate the motherboard chipset and often the socket type that you need to look at getting. But definitely do your due diligence and your homework to ensure you're going to be ordering parts that will work together. These parts cost a pretty penny sometimes, and you do not want to be wasting your money. Now, older motherboards will have two chipsets sometimes, a north bridge and a south bridge. Now, the idea of the north bridge and the south bridge separation was that the north bridge would usually work with high-performing components like CPU, memory, and video, and the south bridge would deal with everything else that was a bit slower and you didn't need that high performance. The thing is, though, these concepts aren't really examined in A+ anymore. I'm only mentioning it here in case you encounter older computers and north bridge and south bridge become a relevant concept. Plus, also, the fact I've just told you this is an old concept and not really part of A+. If you come across any A+ material, you can now straight away age it if it starts talking about north bridge and south bridge seriously and not saying, hey, this is an old thing. Now, let's find our chipsets. Like I said a few moments ago, it's under the heat sinks on your motherboard. Now, usually it'll be near the expansion card where your video cards get plugged into and your RAM. And please be aware it's a heatsink usually in this area. Not a heatsink over here. This heatsink is to keep the power circuitry cool for the CPU on this motherboard. As you can see, this motherboard doesn't have a heatsink around the CPU power circuitry. It's just this one over here. Now, those heatsinks are permanently affixed. Don't mess with them. Usually there's no need to. Something, though, that you might need to deal with once in a while is the CMOS battery. So first of all, CMOS, or complementary metal oxide semiconductor. It's a small battery-powered memory chip on your motherboard, and its job mainly is to maintain the RTC, or real-time clock circuit. Your computer keeps track of the passage of time using a little electronic clock that is battery-powered. And that allows your computer to know what the current date and time is even before an operating system has got up and running, where it can go and find the date and time of the protocol on the internet, like the network time protocol. If you didn't know that existed, now you do. And yes, it is a protocol that does exactly what you think it does. Your operating system goes and finds out what's the current time by asking a server on the internet. Pretty cool, actually. But besides that, it also keeps some BIOS or UEFI firmware settings in memory that cannot be stored permanently. So if you do find, for instance, that your firmware keeps resetting itself to some weird defaults, might be time to change the CMOS battery. So the CMOS battery itself, it's a little coin cell battery that's used to maintain the RTC and firmware settings. It's usually a CR2032 battery. You can often pick that battery up at most hardware stores and pharmacies. It's not a very expensive thing to buy and pretty common. And you can easily recognize it on the motherboard if it's laying flat. Sometimes it might be in a vertically mounted slot, so you might not see it as easily from a top-down view like this, but you can still recognize it pretty quickly and easily. Usually a flathead screwdriver is all you need to push the metal tab that retains it. It pops out, you put a new one in, you're good to go. Then, your RAM slots. Now, I'm looking mainly at the slots here. We're going to look at how RAM works properly in another video. Your RAM slots will be these long vertical slots, usually near the CPU, to minimize how long it takes the CPU to communicate with it. These long boys over here, the CPU socket is over there just behind this person's finger and the RAM module. You might have one, you might have two, you might have more, it all depends on the motherboard. Thankfully though, your RAM does have some notch and tooth keying to make sure you put it in the right way. So just double check the position of the notch and the plastic tooth when you insert it. Also, a bit of advice that always works out well. If you're trying to put something in it doesn't seem to want to fit, it's probably not meant to fit. Try turning it around. Now thankfully the form factor usually corresponds to the motherboard and the CPU compatibility. And nowadays we're often using the double data rate or DDR levels to dictate the physical compatibility, making life a little bit easier. Now you'll also notice there are some plastic latching teeth on the side of the RAM slot. Those little white plastic nubbins you see there. Now usually what you want to do with those plastic teeth is you want to push them open or down before you install the RAM module, and they automatically close when the RAM module is inserted. So you shouldn't need to do anything special with them. And then when you want to remove the RAM module, just push the little plastic nubbin back or down on both sides, and not only does it release the RAM, it also pops it out a little bit to make your life easier when removing it. But when it comes to populating your RAM modules, I highly suggest that you check your motherboard's documentation to figure out which RAM slots must be populated first. We used to be able to say the ones that were closest to the CPU needed to be populated first, but I've seen a lot of motherboards where it's the further ones away they need to be populated, or skip one, populate one, skip one, populate one. It gets a bit annoying and confusing. So best check the documentation that comes in the motherboard's box. If you can't find that documentation, try and look it up online using your phone or another computer. And now, for expansion slots. The thing that makes a desktop computer with a motherboard really powerful. The ability to expand, add to it, customize it, and get it to do exactly what you want it to do and what you need it to do. So first we've got PCIe, or Peripheral Component Interconnect Express. It's the fancy cool slot over here. Now it's a nice high performance expansion card slot, and it's meant to be an improved version of the older PCI standard, which we'll talk about just now. And what's quite nice is it gives very fast and high bandwidth connectivity to your CPU. You get an X1, X4, X8 and X16 PCIe slots. Now one of the ways you'll recognize the PCIe X16 is usually it's a nice long one with a special color, and it'll be quite near your CPU. It's just a little bit off the photo here. You'll notice there's a little gap, a plastic tooth, a gap, and then something at the middle side / right side of the socket that will allow it to hold an expansion card neatly in place. Quite often the X16 slot is used for graphics cards. The smaller X1 slot is this one over here. As you can see, it's got the same gap and tooth system, but it's a lot shorter. And usually it's used for things that need to be high bandwidth, but not necessarily as high bandwidth as video. Maybe a very fast network card or an expansion card that improves SSD storage capabilities. Your X4 slots are a little bit longer than X1, and X8 looks like the X16 but usually is a duller muted color and is often further away from the CPU. Again, you can double check your motherboard's documentation, and usually this will be clearly labeled in that documentation. And then you get your older PCI or Peripheral Component Interconnect standard. They are still present on most modern motherboards, and you'll recognize them being a bit closer to the edge of the motherboard. Long gap, tooth, and then a small gap. Often again also a very boring color, especially compared to your PCIe slots. It's an older standard, like I said, and it is still quite commonly used, as it's great when you want to have an expansion card that doesn't need that high-speed, large bandwidth access to the CPU that PCIe offers. So maybe slower network cards, sound cards, extra USB ports, assuming you're not trying to go for the super latest and greatest fast USB standards, you should be pretty good. And then our storage connectors. So when it comes to storage connectors on your motherboard, you'll often come across cool things like the M.2 connector for M.2 NVMe SSDs that look like that. Now with these guys, they are usually slotted in and often have a retaining screw over there to help hold it down and in place. These are really high-speed SSDs and are directly connected to the motherboard with no need for additional cables or power. Not only is data direct into the motherboard, power is also delivered to them via the motherboard as well. So a very lean and efficient connection. And what's also really cool is the same M.2 that you put in a desktop, you can put it in a laptop as well. It's the exact same form factor, performance, everything. It's a wonderful SSD standard. No difference between laptop and desktop performance here. And then you get SATA, and they look like this on the motherboard. As you can see, it's got a little plastic tooth with a keying in it, a little plastic L shape, if you like. And that ensures you can't put the cable in the wrong way around. Yes, our SATA drives are cable connected. Now, Serial Advanced Technology Attachment, or SATA, can be used for either SSDs or HDDs. And they are, like I said, cable to the motherboard. And if it's cable to the motherboard, oftentimes it also needs its own dedicated cable from the power supply. but that's okay. And then we get some legacy cables, our old IDE or parallel ATA cables and floppy disk drive cables. And the socket on the motherboard will look something like this. You'll also usually see it's one of those gray or yellow ribbon cables. It's really old, probably won't be in your current A+ version you're looking at right now, but again, I'm just warning you in case you come across this in the workplace on a really old computer that's been chugging along for a couple decades now. Now, even more cables that need to be plugged into your motherboard, you will have header pins for this. Header pins are usually there to connect the following things: your power switch, your power LED, hard drive activity indicator LED, and a reset switch if your case has one. Now, usually it'll be found in the bottom right corner of your motherboard, usually in those areas over there. So when you're looking at a motherboard, look in this vicinity, often there, maybe there sometimes. In the case of this picture here, it's these little white pins here. Do yourself a favor, the writing on those pins is really small, so check it in the motherboard's documentation exactly which switch is which. And please be aware the LED switches for power and hard drive, they are polarity sensitive. There will be a positive and a negative wire. Don't mix them around. The switches, they're not too problematic. It doesn't matter which way on they go, as long as they make a connection when you press the button, that's all that matters. But you also get audio header pins as well, and they are usually separate from your general header pins, and will often be a special shaped connector. And it'll either be bottom right corner or bottom edge of your motherboard, usually in this area here. More often than not though, it'll be somewhere in this area. And you will also have USB headers as well for your front panel USB ports. And again, it'll be a shaped connector bundled nicely together, but usually there'll be a pin missing on the header and there'll be a hole missing on the connector. And again, bottom edge, bottom right side. In this case, you can see it clearly marked USB in that picture in the bottom. Oftentimes it is dead center, but again, each motherboard can vary a little bit with where it positions these pins exactly. And then we have our power connector for the motherboard. The main motherboard power connector will be a 24-pin ATX connector. Usually it'll be on the right-hand side of the motherboard, and you can recognize it by looking for a connector that looks something like this. The color of the plastic might be different, but it'll definitely be a 2x12 grid with these square and funny little house shapes to it. And don't worry, you are not going to get it on backwards. It will not fit if you do not have it the right way around. But your CPU nowadays also usually comes with its own dedicated power connector so that it can be directly powered and independent of the motherboard's power. Usually it'll either be a 4 or 8 pin connector or a combination of the two depending on your computer's CPU. So oftentimes it'll either be a pin connector like that, or a combination of the two. Usually it'll be near the CPU, often to the top left of it. Now, one of the main purposes of this exercise is that you know the general layout of an ATX motherboard. You don't have to know every single motherboard that exists, but you do need to know how to find different things. And the ATX layout is done with design and intent. It's not just randomly chosen, there is logic to it. Your CPU is usually up here, your RAM is usually there, your expansion cards are usually in this area at the bottom half, with your video expansion card slots or PCIe slots usually quite close to the CPU, and your integrated I/O I like to keep in the top left when I'm looking at it. Now, I said this has got some design and intent behind it. If we look at this inside of a standard computer case, it's all about the airflow. Now, I've changed the color here of the components to indicate which ones are really warm. Your storage will usually be over here if you have hard drives that are separate to the motherboard, like for example SATA connected drives, and storage drives don't get that hot unless you are working them really hard. Fun fact, you're only ever working your hard drives when you're opening or saving something. Your video cards will get quite toasty, especially if you are working them hard. Your other expansion cards will obviously get warm, but not that much. RAM and CPU though, they will get very warm very quickly because these parts of the computer are always working hard on something. And the design of the ATX layout is to try and maximize the effectiveness of the cooling. So fresh, cool, room temperature air will usually come in, and move over the hard drives. They don't really pick up much heat from the storage drives at all, and then they can be channeled to various components. Some of that relatively cool air will go past the video card and the other expansion cards and not get warmed up too much. And with most modern video cards, they have some sort of ventilation and even active cooling to help force airflow. So often that warm air will be blown out the back of the case. Some of the air will travel up along the RAM modules and get pretty toasty and warm. Some of that air travels through the CPU's heatsink and then out the back of the computer case. So it's usually always fresh cool air in through the front, travels over the warmer components, heats up, and out the top and back. Obviously, you are going to have some desktop cases that might be designed to use different airflow, like with gaming PCs. But the general approach of in through the front and bottom and out through the top and back is the best airflow design for most computers. Regardless of whether it's an ordinary office computer like this or a fancy ass gaming computer like this, it still will work. In through the front bottom, over the warm components, out through the back and top. The power supply being at the top helping with that. With this gaming computer here, you've got a pretty front glass panel, but over there, some ventilation, probably blowing through the AIO water cooler into the chamber, over the other components, and out the top and back. Now, when it comes to installing a motherboard, here's some advice on how to do it. First of all, take electrostatic discharge precautions. We will talk more about that in a later video, but trust me on that. Some content creators say you don't have to worry about static shock damaging the hardware. And that's kind of true, but do you want to be the person that has to replace a very expensive part because the static shock blew it up? I thought not. So this will involve an anti-static work mat, a wrist strap, and a couple of other bits of advice that we'll throw in when we do this in a later video. Then you want to install the standoff connectors into the computer case if they are not already pre-installed. Standoff connectors are these little brass bolts that you screw into the case, and it's got a socket for a screw to go into. That's where the motherboard will be screwed into when it's all done. The cool thing about those standoffs is either they are brass, non-conductive, or they're made of some sort of plastic nylon composite. Now, another bit of advice as well is make sure you insert the I/O shield into the case. That I/O shield is a metal plate that goes around all of the connectors and fits the rectangular cutout in the back of a computer case where the I/O built into the motherboard will stick out. Some motherboards do have the I/O shield built into the I/O port, so you don't have to remember it. But do yourself a favor and just double check anyway, because you're going to put the computer together and then realize you didn't put the I/O shield in. It's not a big deal, it's just somewhere where dust can get in more easily, and curious users and children might stick things in there like fingers or screwdrivers or paper clips just to see what happens. You don't want that. Then, position your motherboard over the standoff connectors. As with most circuit boards, try and handle them by the edge. That helps a lot with minimizing ESD risk. And then, once you've more or less got it positioned over the standoff connectors, secure with the motherboard screws. They usually come with either the case and or the motherboard, so just check the packaging. I suggest when you do tighten the screws down, work on the four corners of the motherboard first, and then worry about your central screws last. That way your four corners keep it nicely in place, and if you do not have enough screws, well, the four ones in the corner will be the more important ones. Then you can comfortably plug in the power connectors for your motherboard. The 24-pin ATX connector, the CPU, and any other power connectors that might be relevant. Usually this is best to do now because it's going to get harder when you populate with more components inside of a computer case. In fact, some people often install their CPU and heat sinks and the RAM modules before inserting the motherboard, but it's personal preference, whatever's going to be easier for you. Some people encourage doing it outside because if you just pre-assemble, you can check that everything's working and you've got a booting computer before you put the time and effort into assembly. However, my concern is you might run the risk of bumping and damaging some parts on the computer before you install it, because the case is meant to be a nice, safe area for a very sensitive piece of electronics to happily work, that being your motherboard and all of its associated parts. But choice is yours which one you want to go with. Now let's talk about identifying the parts of your motherboard. Now, the reason why I want to do this is I know this is something that is expected of you for the A+ exam, that you should be able to look at a picture of a motherboard and find all of the parts on it. So my tip is usually to try and orient or visualize the motherboard like this, even if it's the other way around on the screen. Have the CPU more or less in the top area and your I/O shield in the top left corner. That will make your life a little bit easier, especially because when you do open up the side panel of a computer and look inside, this is often the position the motherboard is in. So it's what you're going to see in the real world too. Nonetheless though, let's work through it. First up, your RAM slots are always these long vertical slots near the CPU. Your motherboard power connector is always over there. You'll usually find some SATA connectors along the right side, often right bottom corner. The chipset, like I said, is always under that heatsink on the motherboard, so it's over there. Quite a small heatsink actually. You might come across some M.2 connectors. They can be positioned anywhere, so get familiar with what they look like. I've even seen M.2 connectors sitting near the PCIe slots. Your CMOS battery is sitting over there. Very hard to tell. That's one of those vertically mounted ones I mentioned earlier. Here's your header pins for this motherboard. Your front panel connectors are down there. Those are PCI connectors, partly because they're a boring color, but if you look closely, they are very near the edge of the motherboard compared to the rest of them. Long gap, tooth, small gap in the middle. Your PCIe X8 connectors are these ones here. Experience will help you recognize them, but they are using the PCIe keying. They're a bit more central compared to PCI. A little bit more distance between the edge of that connector and the edge of the motherboard here. Add to that as well, they're not as long as a standard PCIe or even PCI connector. Another PCI connector up here for some or other reason. And then a nice full fat PCIe X16 connector there. Nice and long, quite a decent distance from the edge, gap, tooth, long gap, and a little white clip there to retain the expansion card, and it is quite close to the CPU. That is normally one of the indicators that that will always be the fastest expansion slot, usually reserved for video cards. As we started earlier, your integrated I/O is all over here. Your CPU is over there, but hard to ignore. Please note the black plastic thing in the middle is just a blank cover to protect the LGA sockets pins. Your CPU power is up there, and you'll have a CPU fan controller usually nearby. The CPU fan controller will work with the fan that comes with the heatsink and CPU. And its job is to control and power the heatsink's fan if you are going with a heatsink for cooling. But that is the labeling of a motherboard for you. Obviously, the motherboards will vary, so something you could try out is go and look up pictures of motherboards on Google image search and try and do the labeling and identification of parts for yourself. But these are the things you definitely want to be able to recognize on a motherboard, especially for your CompTIA A+ exam. Otherwise though, that was that on the motherboard. We will do a video on memory and CPU and all of that as cool parts as well. But for now, I'd like to say thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope this helped you with the motherboard section for your A+. And if you have any friends or family members, colleagues or peers who are also working towards their A+ certification, don't be afraid to share this video with them. Otherwise though, I'll catch you in the next video.